All right. Well, good morning or good afternoon. We're right on the cusp there at 12 o'clock. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn session. A very warm welcome from myself. My name's Ian Galley. I'm the chair of the RIMS New Zealand and Pacific Island chapter. On behalf of the board, a very warm welcome to what is the first of a number of scheduled Lunch and Learn sessions by Ross Liston from Crucible & Co. RIMS has engaged with Ross to deliver our online learning for our members, and it's been previously extremely well received. And over the next couple of months, we're looking to address topics such as risk and strategy, risk and resilience, risk maturity, risk and opportunity management, project risk management, and control design, implementation, and assurance. However, today, to kick off what promises to be another engaging and insightful session, from silo to synergy, embedding risk management and strategic planning. And I'd like to welcome you, Ross. Ross is the founding director and principal of Crucible & Co., consultancy specialising in risk and resilience management. He has over 25 years global experience, helping all levels of organisations to better understand and manage their risks. And that's really bolstered by complementing competencies around strategy, operationalisation, management of change, coupled with his experience that he brings. He can provide valuable insights on how best to formulate and integrate risk management practices. So a warm welcome, Ross, and over to you for the session today.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I'm very aware that there are a number of you in the audience that are probably quite familiar with this topic, and if we had the privilege of being in the room together, I'd really be keen to have your insights. So if there are some comments you'd like to put in the chat or Q&A, I'll try and get to them towards the end. Otherwise, I'm just going to crack on, and apologies if it feels like I'm talking to you or not with you. But anyway, let's get cracking. So, does everyone see my presentation? It's all clear to you? Cool. Okay. So, Ian, thank you for the introduction. For those of you who aren't aware, I've been working with RIMS for a number of years, putting together these Lunch and Learn presentations. The object of these presentations is to try and provide some content that's not necessarily in any framework or any documentation. It's, some unwritten rules of risk management experiences that I've had, and many of you that I've spoken to, what you can share. So I'm looking forward to sharing those insights today, particularly around risk and strategy. So if we start with this concept, risk and strategy are two sides of the same coin. It's said quite often, and when I worked in Big Four, it would be part of the pitch we'd make to clients. But really, when you think about it, what do we do with it? It's all well and fine. Conceptually, it makes a lot of sense, but it's really hard that if any of you are in a risk practitioner position to be able to demonstrate that this connection exists or have it become a meaningful, engaging conversation in the business. So what I'm going to do today is, first of all, try and clarify these terms. In all the time that I've worked in risk, I've realized that if we don't get on the same page with the terminology, we can lose one another. So I'll start off with that. And then give us sort of a 30,000-foot view of where does risk interact with strategy, just so that we're all on the same page. Then think about how does risk interact with various strategic or strategy models, because just as we have multiple frameworks and approaches, so too does strategy. And then talk to some of the sort of injection points or integration points that we can link the two processes. I'll touch on a couple tools that you can use in this process. Some of them you'll be very familiar with, some you may not have considered, and sort of steer you to where you can find more of them. And then lastly, because we're dealing with strategies, to move the conversation beyond the threat. And that always creates a bit of a segue to some of the future sessions I'll be doing. So let's just clarify these concepts of risk and strategy. I think it's commonplace that when you speak to people, everybody in an organization thinks that they agree what these terms are. But the minute you try and compile some risk collateral, everybody has an opinion and wants to have varying opinions captured. They will tell you, no, strategy is not that, or risk isn't that, or what do you mean by principal risk? What do you mean by strategic risk? And consequently, if you can't bed that down, the minute you need to interact with the organization, they are coming at this from very different points, and it's not helping you move the dial forward, and it's not helping the conversation provide value. So I know this is a little bit of a busy slide, but literally there's sort of 4 takes on when we merge these terms, risk and strategy. So starting in the top left-hand corner, risk strategies that often gets bandied about is really sort of the risk treatments. How are we going to treat and respond to any risks we have in the business? So that's risk strategies. Then there's the strategy for risk, which is sometimes people say, what's your risk strategy? And what they might be meaning is, what do you plan to do with risk management as a capability in the business? It normally comes as a sort of the bookend to a maturity or capability assessment. Moving down to the left bottom corner, there's strategic risk, which is really where businesses create or accept risk, where they're trying to create value. And it's one of what I treat as the 3 main buckets of risk: strategic risk, operational risk, and external risk. And just one of my sort of call outs around that is that strategic risk doesn't necessarily mean exactly the same as what's in the strategy. Strategic risk can be much wider. It can be things that predate the current strategy. And so it's not necessarily a one-for-one relationship. And then lastly, the strategy and risk integration, which is really what we're trying to aim for in a lot of today's conversation. So if I talk around strategic risk, this is obviously a key element for when we deal with the executive and the governance levels of the organizations. And just for clarification, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but the sort of 3 main takes that I've often seen discussed around strategic risk is it's around the positioning. So what is the strategy? Is it sustainable? Is it achievable? Because if you select something that isn't going to do that for the business, that might be a risk in itself. There's the execution risk, and I guess this draws parallels with sort of project management. We've decided what we're going to do, are we able to do it? And then lastly, there's some concern around the governance of strategic risk. I was previously involved in an organization where midway through a sort of reporting cycle, one of the board members resigned, and that had many implications for the way the market viewed what was going on. So it's a part of the business that's sometimes overlooked, but it doesn't sit neatly within an operational risk sort of taxonomy. So that's one of the other areas. I'm not going to deal with these in any great detail, because really, if that's what the executive board are after, this is what we're after. We as risk practitioners really want to see some closer alignment and closer integration of strategy and risk. So what does that look like? As I said, what does that 30,000 foot view look like for us? So let's begin with this sort of overarching concept. So we have the light grey box is our context. It's where the business exists. And then within that, we have these 3 other parts to the Venn diagram, which is, what is our strategy? So where do we want to create, protect, and realize value? We have the bottom left, that sort of culture and values element, which is heavily around how does the business work and what do we claim to want to do. And if you attended last week's call by Michael Corley, would have called out the importance of the culture and the values of the business. And then the dark grey area, which is obviously where risk sits, that sort of compliance lenses. Are we allowed to do this? The risk lens of, do the benefits outweigh the costs, and the ethics, is this the right thing to do? And obviously the interface of all 3 of those is where our appetite sits. So that's the sort of overarching view of how a risk practitioner would probably say to the rest of the business, this is where risk fits in. It may not be seen in the same way from a strategy perspective, or anyone within sort of PNC looks after culture, but this is the view that I've always worked to, the most simplified view I can articulate that. But if I want to look at it from a more sort of process-oriented view, if I look at strategy and I follow those main sort of blocks, which is, what do we want to do, moving through to, can we do it, then into, how do we do it, and then we actually do it, and then there's this, is it working? And we check on, have we prioritized and planned correctly? Do we have the capability and capacity? And then, are our intents and objectives correct? So, and are we doing what we should do in alignment with it? That's what any part of sort of strategy and performance management looks into. And it's very easy to sort of overlay conceptually where risk falls in. So over the first sort of two bubbles, we have the risk profiling. So what are our risks? How bad are they? and that will transition to appetite. Well, what do we want to do about it? How much do we want to take on? Which then transitions into sort of the risk setting, and that's normally where we have our thresholds and our triggers and our performance metrics. That'll be part and parcel of how things are executed, so that when at the bottom we are collecting the sort of the risk information, we are checking on those elements. Does the profile remain the same? Is our appetite appropriate? Are we working in accordance with the appetite? And these are cyclical in nature, and quite simply put, I don't see any major difference between what strategy is trying to achieve and what risk is trying to achieve. We shouldn't really exist for our own purposes. We should be there to support the sort of the main core of what the business is trying to do. And if we then try and get more specific around what that risk might look like, we can talk to, there was a model that COSO in combination with PwC developed a number of years ago, which was around understanding the risk of the strategy, the risk to the strategy, and the risk from the strategy. And what I try to do is map it almost in this matrix with looking on the left-hand side, where does this risk originate and where does the risk get experienced in the business? So obviously that interface of where the strategy is impacting the strategy is really, what is the risk of our strategy? Is it the right strategy? Is it sustainable? Is it the right thing to do? And quite often, most of us in the risk field within a business don't ever get involved in those conversations. We may do from time to time, and I'd encourage you, where you're able to, is to be involved in those conversations where you can. Then we look at the other aspects of the risk to the strategy, and that's typically coming from operationally. Is there anything in the business that is impacting on how effective we can be at the strategy? And then externally, is there anything outside the business that can be impactful on the strategy? And then you can then, once you've developed the strategy, look at how does that impact on the business? So how does what our strategy is doing impact on our operations? And then what our strategy is doing impact on the external environment? And this is where things like sustainability and climate impacts come in. There's obviously a lot of other things which I've got in light grey, which are more operational. But the reason why I use this diagram is, if you think about our risk taxonomies, if you think about our risk consequence tables associated with the risk matrix, there will be occasions where the wording or the criteria is talking about a risk to the business. Sometimes it's not from the business, and very seldom are you looking at them in both ways. And I think what's really keen to understand, and I guess this would apply to operational risk as much as to strategic risk, is to think about that, the risk to, the risk from, and if you're fortunate enough to get involved in those conversations, the risk of the strategy. And, if you're heavily involved in things like climate transition and all that, you will probably be more interacting with the risk of the strategy. But this really just helps you to think through the inside out, outside and impact on the business, and where risk would link very well into the strategic conversation. I guess the question, as I said right at the beginning, is in the same way that risk has many frameworks, there are multiple frameworks and models for strategy. And I've always been of the opinion that if we want to have a more meaningful interaction with the business, whether we are talking cyber or technology or P&C or climate, we need to be able to talk their language. So it helps if you can speak strategy in the business. And what I mean by that is understand what the kind of models are that the business will adopt for strategy. So there's a really interesting piece of work that was done by our Boston Consulting Group in sort of 2012 to 2015, where they were looking at various strategies in various businesses. And one of the people from BCG wrote a book called Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. And what he and his co-authors had done is that look back from the sort of the late 1950s up till then, 2013, 2015, and try to understand what were all the new strategy models that were coming out all the time. And I'm going to work through a couple of these just to give you a sense of what they are. I'm not going to delve into them any depth, but what I'd like you to see is that in the right-hand corner, there are 5 main types or archetypes in the strategy palette. There are classical models, there are visionary models, there are adaptive models, there are shaping models, and there are renewal models. And I'll explain more around what that means. But what I'd like you to see from this first slide is we're looking at the period of 1958 to 1980, and you will see things like scenario plan, pestle or steeple, whatever you want to call it, SWOT, five forces, all those things are happening there. But you'll notice that all of those are blue. All of those are classical. And then as we move into the 80s, we start to see some other models coming in. And here, the two that I called out was McKinsey's 7S model, which was, very popular in the 80s and 90s. Six Sigma, which to this day is still very popular. But again, they still predominantly they are involved with classical strategy. Through the 90s, we have the sort of the color palette changing a bit. You start seeing various models coming in that are more aligned with what's going on in that context in the world at the time. Triple bottom line became prominent, value chain analysis. And so if you bring it all through to, well, they only had it up to 2013. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything more recent. You can see that the color palette has definitely shifted, and you have things like strategy maps, blue ocean strategy becoming more commonplace. That's really how this was transpiring. And the reason why I mention that is so that you can understand what do we mean by these 5 different archetypes. And so the archetypes that the BCG came up with is they said, if we take 2 variables, the one is how unpredictable the business environment is, and how changeable that environment is, we can have different positions to consider. So the first one obviously is that classical one, and it's I can predict what's going to happen, but I can't change it. And most FMCG companies, I've called out PepsiCo would be an example here. Yes, you can have very influential marketing teams around, whether Pepsi's bidding Coke, whatever the case may be, but whether people drink beverages or not is really something that you can't really change that much. Then we move across to the more changeable side, and this is where the more visionary businesses are. So I can predict it, and I can change it. And Tesla and the likes of EV companies will sort of sit in this space to some extent. When we move up to ones where there is a higher degree of unpredictability, we now have the shaping businesses. They can't predict it, but they can change it. And I've listed Alphabet here. And these are typically the companies that build ecosystems where they have a whole lot of platforms that all interact, and they leverage a wide range and coordinate a wide range of entities to have a successful business. And then the area where there's very little you can do to change and it's very unpredictable is the more adaptive business models. And very common in this area has been many of the microchip manufacturers. And so I've put in NVIDIA here. And I suppose, given the fact that some of this research is several years old, there might be arguments on how things have changed and where they might move. But for all intents and purposes, these are just the kinds of principles we want to bear in mind, that if we as risk practitioners want to interact with the business, we need to be better positioned around these conversations. The last one that comes up is really this one of renewal. And this is where the harshness sort of variable comes into it. And I think post-COVID, there would be another number of businesses that would sit there. But when this model was discussed and became quite commonplace, the main thing that they looked at was what happened after the global financial crisis. And it was the reason behind so many lean models, business reengineering, how do we cut back? And that's really the focus of that model. So you have these 5 different options that business can adopt. And what I wanted to call out is that there's strong parallels between the strategy and the risk world, where the context you find yourself in will change how you deal with risk. So while this model depicts 5 separate blocks, it is not uncommon for businesses to move through them, particularly into the adaptive and the renewal spaces, because things will change and they need to adapt. So the fact that you choose to be in one area doesn't mean that you're stuck there for good. So if I can take each one of those very briefly, just so you understand how do they differ, and present a view of what the main steps are. This will give you an idea of where risk can look to interact or inject itself into the process. So the classical model is really, we want to be big. The way we approach our strategy is we analyze things, we plan things, and we execute things. It's very vanilla. And as you saw, most of those strategies follow this kind of logic. When we move into the more visionary space, this is I want to be first. So I envisage the future I want to have, I build it, and I persist. And that's the intention of what I'm trying to do in that space. In the shaping space, I want to be the orchestrator. And as I said, this is the kinds of businesses that build the ecosystems that we are finding commonplace today, the Apples, the Alphabets, etc. This is where they play. They are engaging a number of players and people that they can rope into their ecosystem. They orchestrate how those all work and they evolve them. And consequently, that's what that shaping model looks like. The adaptive one is we really need to be fast. We will survive if we adapt to changes. If we're too slow in doing it, that, coming second isn't necessarily going to be the best way to respond. So here we're looking at varying our strategy, selecting what's appropriate, and then scaling up what we're doing. And it's that cycle that we keep repeating to be adaptive. And then lastly, the renewal is we really want to be viable. So we either are reacting to a trend or an event such as a COVID or the financial crisis. And I guess in the wake of the Trump tariffs, we might see strategies going in this route where we have to react and either, if we're fortunate enough, anticipate what might happen and then find a way to economize in the business. Because obviously many of these things is I don't have the resources and particularly financial to overcome or to implement the strategy I want. So I've got to economize, and through that I will slowly grow, but I'm not just sort of sitting back. So this is just really the view of those different kinds of models around strategy so that we have a far clearer understanding of where we can get involved. And so if I transition from those views, I'm going to just talk through using the classical model because that's the probably the easiest way to demonstrate it. If we take the classical model, the places where risk can get involved is we can get involved before any analysis takes place. So we might be the one that is taking the annual WEF report on risks to our strategists. We might be the one that are doing the risk radar analysis of what are the emerging trends, what are we seeing develop. We become an entry point, or at least have a seat at the table to that conversation. Because bear in mind, any strategist worth their salt is typically doing this as second nature. This is why they are in those roles. They know how to think around what is evolving, what's developing, and analyzing that to be appropriate. But there's no reason why we can't add information to that and change some of the biases that might already reside there. We can be the black hat wearer and contribute to the conversation. When we get to them analyzing, we can get involved in that analysis. So it can be looking at the pros and cons and in some way contributing to what gets selected from a strategic point of view. And then as we sort of bed down the strategy and move into a more planning and execution role, we can get involved in those too. So from a planning perspective, we can start exploring what are the risks from and to the strategy. We can help develop any sort of KRIs and KPIs and whatever the metrics might be. And then when it's being executed, we are providing the monitoring, the performance monitoring, and in some instances, the assurance of what's going on. So there are many places where the interaction between risk and strategy can take place, but obviously it's the earlier part of strategy before it becomes the sort of the performance and execution side that we really want to try and have an influence over, and not just for the sake of being influential, but if we are risk practitioners beyond just completing risk reports, this is where we can contribute. And I think from a personal perspective, this is where I get a lot of enjoyment, where there's a richness to the conversation that is not always present once we get into the business as usual part of things. So I'm going to just talk through a diagram that I've got here, which tries to portray what would the ideal process look like. I have spoken to this diagram in one of the previous RIMS learning sessions, but I'm hoping that there's a number of you that didn't see that and you'll be okay with me doing this. So if I look at the left-hand side, I'm essentially looking at the functional and operational business units going up to leadership and then up to the governance layer. So if we assume that we are working up those layers, and you could argue functional and operation move around, but for the sake of simplicity, this is how I've portrayed it. What we would see happen is that a typical strategic process would look something along these lines, where the strategy team will interact with various levels of the business to formulate a strategy, or at least the first iteration of the strategy. That then goes through a cycle of evaluation before it goes through to the board, where the board approves it. That then cascades down into communication from the executive level so that everyone knows how to proceed. You get the sort of the broad objectives and you proceed with developing your plans. As you're developing your plans, you will refine and review them with leadership and make sure they're okay, and then you get into execution. That would be the logic of how a typical strategy development process would play out. If we had the perfect world where risk could get engaged in this process, it would look like this. Now, maybe some of this text is too small to see on your screens, but really what I'm looking at here is moving from left to right. And the first sort of two pillars that I've shown there can be done in either order, but literally what you're trying to do is you're trying to get a view from within the business of their bottom-up view of risks and what they see emerging, and bearing in mind the way the operational part of the business sees emerging trends can be very different from what the executive and the board see, because emerging trends are things that emerge from multiple different business units. You might find that despite the different kinds of functions we have, we might see a people issue evolving or developing in different areas that's going to percolate up, which is something that might not be clear from the executive or from the board level down. So essentially, we're collecting information to get the bottom-up view. We're then collecting information to get the top-down view and other emerging risks. And from that, we purposely feed that information into the strategy discussion in whatever shape or form, whether it's a principal risk report, whether it's a key business risk report, whatever we want to call it. We would be providing them with up-to-the-minute views of what is the risk in the business and outside the business that they need to bear in mind. And as I say, strategists do this on their own. That's just the way they think about the world. But sometimes there may be biases, sometimes there might be challenges, and it's made easier when the risk function sits in a different area that allows them to provide some independence and is not almost being drawn into the same view of the world. But anyway, that information would then inform how the strategy is finalized. And then as we start to develop the business plans, risk plays a role there again, from a guidance and a support and a challenge. What are your risks from the strategy? What are your risks to the strategy? What are the plans and the controls we're going to put in place? And then that gets sort of woven into how execution takes place. So that's the ideal world. This is what we'd like to see happen. I haven't put any timelines there. It has been drawn so that it's easy enough to present. But what I'd like to stress is, while this is what we would wish to achieve, this is not what I've seen happen. So I'm going to take a similar sort of diagram and I'm going to look at it maybe within in a 1 year cycle, and whether this is a financial year or calendar year, it's trying to make the point. I will put a disclaimer in here. This is not any one organization. It's what I've seen in many places. It's what I've read about. And this is what I tend to see. The tendency is, and the lighter colors and the darker colors are trying to make a distinction between the previous year or the previous strategy and the future strategy. And you could argue where these lines sort of transition. But what I really wanted to try and demonstrate is, while it has the exact same pieces from the previous diagram, so taking the strategy to be reviewed and finalized with the board and then translated into business plans, this process tends to take quite a long time from the very first conversation of what the strategy is going to be to when it's almost been implemented and starting to be tweaked. It takes a good portion of the year. This is not a quick cycle from what I've seen. What that means is that when I superimpose the risk on top of it, and yes, I appreciate this is a very messy view, and I will speak to it in clearer slides shortly. What I've found is that the calendar that a enterprise risk team works to is heavily driven by the governance calendar. We've identified when ARC and board meetings are going to happen. We've identified when the executive meetings are going to happen. We've identified when we need to report certain things. So when do we review of the risk appetite? When do we need to get a clear view of principal risks or key risks? Some of those things are all predefined. They are completely removed from the strategy cycle, which seems to be allowed to concertina to accommodate the strategy, and rightly so, because it doesn't follow any specific calendar. But there will be times where that needs to be finalized. It needs to link into any disclosures to the market. It needs to follow financial years for the disclosures of that. So while on the surface it looks like we have all these things sort of running in step, there are a couple problems that I've picked up. And the reason why I'm raising these problems is to encourage every one of you who is in a risk role, who interacts with the business from a planning and an operational execution, as well as the strategy side, is to make the business aware of how some of these things can be out of kilter. So the first thing that is the risk and strategy timing and purpose are not synced. So I've seen instances where what I'm trying to show you on the left-hand side is we've gone to great lengths to find out what the key risks are from a top-down and bottom-up perspective in the business. Some of them are looking at historical risks, some of them are looking up to date, and it's all in to sort of pull together a paper for the executive that needs to be delivered at certain early in this year time frame. But it's only several months later that we're starting to develop the strategy. And so some of the risks, even if they are fit into that process, are already past their sort of sell-by date. Some of them will be evergreen and won't change, but there will be a shift where the risk conversation is no longer happening at the same time. And then we'll go, okay, well, we'll do another view of the risks. We've got a 6-monthly review of our bottom-up risks, and we'll do that as is required. But we're doing it prior to any plans being developed from the strategy, and we haven't really done it the other way around, where we should be considering how do the two interact. So you get the situation where you have risk information being collected and you have strategy information being developed, and they are just out of lockstep. We're not able to get them dovetailing in close enough for it to be really meaningful. That's one of the things I've seen happen. The second thing I've seen happen is it's a certain time of the year we need to do the risk appetite, and we do the risk appetite. And it can happen before we've even finalized our strategy. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, because when you develop a risk appetite, your choosing might be, I'm going to go with the evergreen principal risks in our business, or the principal risks we've just identified through the sort of the top-down view. So all well and fine. It may also be where our appetite has been developed around our risk taxonomy, and we've gone, well, we're going to take each one of the main groupings and have an appetite around that. But I think what seems to be the preferred way, or a more meaningful way, is that our appetite is specific to our strategic objectives. So if we have 5 strategic objectives, we would develop appetite conversations around each one of those. And those might be multifunctional. So we might have a strategy that's talking around product development and the revenue we want to generate. So we need to have appetite that is catering for what will we allow in terms of the product, what will we be cautious around in terms of compliance, what will be our sales targets. So there are multiple angles to those strategic objectives that are captured in the appetite. Unfortunately, appetite has been in the calendar, and we are going to do it at a time, and because of the way the the strategy conversation might be delayed, we miss one another. Another thing I've seen is appetites being either updated 2-yearly or 3-yearly. And for me, that just makes no sense. How can you work to the same appetite, particularly if you're getting into the metrics? It's okay to have your overarching sort of stance towards the risk being we are risk avoidant, or we will pursue that risk, which may not change dramatically. But if we are going to have meaningful performance metrics, our ceilings and our floors and our trigger points, those have to be more closely aligned with what's happening now as opposed to something that happened a year or two ago. So we get this outdated risk appetite, which ends up being more around reporting than adding value in some instances. And then the last one I wanted to really call out, and this is where it sort of is more just risk specific than linking into strategy, but it makes clear why we sometimes have such a disconnect. And that is the fact that we have such long review times. If the board is sitting in the end of April, we need to have loaded the finalized paper into diligent the week before that. The week prior to that, we might have had a board forum or an executive meeting that needed to review the content. That needed to be loaded the week before, and that was compiled by the risk function a week before. So you're already at sort of 4 or 5 weeks out. So anything that is getting up into particularly from a risk information, anything that's getting up to the most senior levels of the business and governance levels is literally a rear view mirror of what's going on. The strategy conversations are not as beholden to some of these things. Yes, there will be papers that go through a similar delayed review cycle, but what tends to happen is I've sat in board meetings where we talk around strategy and it's at this point in time, and then we review the risk paper, and the risk paper is 2 weeks at a minimum out of date. And that really just can't be the kind of value we add. And I know this is probably made easier in organizations that have very sophisticated risk management systems where we can almost take a snapshot in real time very early on. But there is a tendency for these long review times to cause the risk papers to be completely removed from what's happening in the strategic or the performance world. And so my request to you, or my suggestion to you, is not to just be beholden to these processes, but to try and drive a better alignment. And it's up to us to do it, because no one's going to do it for us. So that is what I would encourage you to think about. So knowing full well that we have these cycles, it's how do we get engaged? Where would there be what would be the appropriate tools to use at the appropriate time? And so what you might look at is just to go, let's start off simple. As I said, strategists will often focus on the precursors to where our risk view is. So if I work through this example of around climate, just for simplicity's sake, climate change is obviously a global trend that everyone, and I'm talking about the real change, not necessarily what's in the press, but this is the things that we know are transpiring and are supported by the science and even some of the rigor that challenges those views. But that's the trend and the driving force we're aware of. We know that this will influence variables and that there will be changes to how that impacts the business. We need to be asking and facilitating those conversations around so what. So you move from climate change being the concern, the variables that might be impacted could be temperature and rainfall. What would be a pessimistic change, an increase in the number of hot days or more rain, whatever the case may be? What would that impact be like in the environments in which we work? And we could go, okay, there could be a high demand for cooling, and we happen to be a business that interacts. Either we provide that kind of infrastructure, or we need to energize it, or whatever the case may be. We can then bring it all the way down to the risk and go, well, if we're an energy company, for instance, we're unable to meet that demand. So we've taken the trend that the strategists are looking at, and we've interpreted it as a risk. So that's a simple way we can get involved. We can even get more involved and expand that simple tool set into something like taking the trend analysis into this trend mapping matrix on the left, and just be certain that I'm looking at impact versus uncertainty, not impact versus probability. And this is really trying to understand where there are things that we really have a lot of uncertainty about, which is really the shared domain of strategy and risk. And from that, we can use those. I've taken an orange and a gray variable and create the scenarios, the optimistic and the pessimistic scenarios. And then I would really say quite often when I've seen scenario analysis done, and I'm not saying I've been in every scenario analysis conversation in a business, there's not always the consideration of what happens if it doesn't happen that way. What happens if the conservative regime in America decides to backtrack on ESG or on climate change? What does that mean for us? And consequently, it's really useful for us as the risk practitioners to be asking those challenging questions to the strategy. So that's a simple tool set. Then there's obviously all the industry bodies. So you'll either have, I've got the internal auditors body, they have resources that talk to some tools you can use during strategy. COSO and ISO will always have things. I know ISO 31000 is in the process of being rewritten at the moment. The extent to which it'll pick up on strategy and specific tools, I don't know. But, what you should be doing is leveraging all the resources that the likes of RIMS have. They have a load of resources that if you're a member, you're able to access them. You can interact with people around the world and get some information. Obviously, there's a lot of information that has a strong insurance bias, which will probably serve a number of you on the call. But there are these resources available that, if anything, will give you confirmation of how to approach things, even if you may not be doing it that way. So draw on what the industry bodies have and you will find those resources. If you're not able to find that, or what you might find is some of these documents are very broad brush and still don't get into the nitty gritty, you should look at something like the North Carolina State Pool College of Management. They have an enterprise risk management initiative. There are loads and loads and loads of content in there. And over the last couple of months, they've been releasing, coincidentally, risk tools that can be used. And I've just selected 3 of them here. I've got Porter's 5 Forces, which is a strategy framework that you can use for risk. They've got PESTLE Analysis, which is a strategy framework that you can use for risk. And then there's some things around strategic drivers and how to understand them and influence them as the risk practitioner. And for those of you who have no idea of what Porter's 5 Forces is, this is developed by Michael Porter. What he did is he looked at 5 variables, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but I'm just trying to demonstrate what you can get when you look at these tools. I've really just done screen grabs from within the tool. It tells you about the 5 forces that we're trying to do, and then it gives you a template that you can populate with questions. So you are provided with guidance that you can go and ask these questions either of yourself and put the content in, or go and see the business and get some content and win over the strategists in the business to go, listen, I've got some idea of what the risks might look like, so that you can factor them into your strategy. Or at least if you've got your strategy, we can tell you what the risks from that strategy are, or the risks to that strategy. So that tool set is there for you to use, and I would encourage you to use it. And just what I've just shown you there is scenario planning, PEST or PESTLE analysis, and 5 forces are ironically tools from the 70s and 60s from strategy that have been updated to be used as risk tools today. And it's just because the simplicity and the fundamentals serve them. But I think what I've clearly tried to highlight there is, through the blue, is that they all they serve classical risk and classical strategy, should I say. And what we really need to be thinking about is, what do we do about this, the remainder of this palette, where we see all these other colors? Because I don't believe that there is enough within the space that is readily accessible to us as risk practitioners that we can serve these different strategies. And I mean, obviously, not every business sits down and goes, I'm going to do open innovation, or I'm going to do value innovation. It's not always that apparent. But if we think about and become a little bit more familiar with what those strategies look like and research them, we are at least in a position to have a more informed viewpoint and contribute in the right way. Because you can understand that if I've gone the route of the classical strategy and I'm dealing with a business that is more in the shaping or visionary realm, you will notice that many of the popular newer industries, internet, software, services, software and media, all on the right-hand side, they are looking for they will be following different kinds of strategies and not the classical world of, cars, paper and forest, oil and gas. So really, we need to be thinking around, if we know what those potential cycles look like from a strategic perspective, we may be better positioned to take an appropriate answer or provide an appropriate input to the strategist. And in so doing, find that we are shaping not only the risk content going into the strategy, but what would be the requirements around our risk reporting, our risk monitoring that serve that need. Because I think a lot of our stuff is quite vanilla. It does enough, it does what it says on the box, but for it to be completely value adding, it needs to be more strategically aligned, and it needs to be shaping the risk calendar of reporting and monitoring that I showed you to be linking in more closely with strategy and more flexible in its application. And that's not to say we don't have a situation where there are instances of we can provide a paper to the board now or delay things. We're not completely hemmed in, but I find it very frequent is the case that I see this happening, where these long lead times really just suck the value out of any risk contribution to the conversation. The more we can push that and have those risk insights come under our banner, not just a conversation piece within strategy that we're not party to, the more valuable it is. And obviously this needs to be adapted for various organizations. It needs to cater for the personalities and the cultures and the politics. It's not a one size fits all. And the better we are at doing that, the better we'll see our work influence what happens within the business. So just in sort of bringing things to a conclusion, the thing that I wanted to really call out, and as I said, I like to segue between my presentations just so that you see some degree of continuity, is we need to understand that we need to start moving beyond just having threat conversations. So when we appreciate that strategic risk is heavily focusing on pursuing risk and creating value, we need to realize we cannot just focus on threat. We have to consider opportunity as well. So we need to expand our risk artifacts, our risk collateral, our risk conversations to look at both sides. Otherwise, we sometimes just dismissed out of hand. And to make this clearer, think about these sort of three main risk types. This isn't a title or it's not a naming convention, but it's the way I think about it. Risks can either be one-sided or two-sided. The world of the risk matrix is typically only one-sided, despite all its shortcomings, even in the one-sided world, but it really struggles to cater for the two-sided risk, the things where there are opportunities. But if we work through the three options here, the top one is what we are most familiar with, where we are trying to avoid the threat, the downside risk. And this is the sort of the realm of health and safety. We're up in the right-hand side of the risk matrix and we don't like it then. We want to try and put it down, and all our efforts go into doing that. We then have the two-sided risk where we are still prioritizing avoiding the threat, but there's this sort of incidental realization of potential opportunities. And this is what you're seeing with some of the climate risk management. If I'm trying to, let's take an energy company. If I'm producing energy through thermal resources and I'm needing to bring that down and manage that threat, the opportunities that arise is I can offer, EVs, solar, all these kind of things. So we've tried to get rid of the threat, and through that there are opportunities. So it's doing with one and getting a benefit. Then the last one at the bottom is where we prioritize pursuing opportunity. And this is the world of the traders within the business and the market risk world. We are purposely trying to pursue the opportunity, but we acknowledge that there is going to be threat. There's going to be a drop if we get it wrong. And so we need to realize that within our world that we serve in our businesses, we are catering for all types of risk. Predominantly, we end up catering for the avoid threat. And as I've said before, this is typically the world of operational risk. There's very seldom going to be a lot of beneficial or the opportunity pursuit in the operational world. You might see it being more prevalent in projects where we're looking at benefits realization. And there's a segue to another one of the talks that we're going to be doing later in the year. But what I'd like you to understand is that for us to be of value to strategists, we need to understand these three different conversations and not just be focusing on what can go wrong and be seen as the proverbial handbrake in the business. So my final remark is why start off this campaign of these lunch and learns on this subject. And what I'd like to call out is risk is probably most important at the strategic level. So if you look at this, you take the bubbles in the middle being from strategic level down to operational level. And I look on the left-hand side, it's at the strategic level where the business takes risk. It's the markets we choose to play in. It's what we choose to do. That's where the business takes risk. At a more operational level is where we control the risk. So we need to make sure that we're controlling those risks appropriately. And obviously that's the world of operational risk. And then on the right side, it's at the strategic level where risk has the biggest impact on the business. If we get some of those fundamental strategic decisions wrong, it'll have a far bigger impact on the business than at an operational level. Bear in mind, we are appreciative that you can have an operational risk, a long-tail risk like a compliance thing that goes wrong or our reputation is compromised from an operational practice. And obviously we see a lot of the developments within the financial services world have come out of operational issues, but my personal opinion, they've obviously been driven by strategic revenue initiatives that have fed through, but I won't speak to that now. But we will find that there's always a much stronger attention given to focusing risk at an operational level, and I think we need to make sure that even if we do that, we do not do it at the expense of not catering for the risk at the more strategic levels. And that's it. I don't know if anyone's got any questions to ask.
I think a couple have come through the Q&A there, Ross. First one was from Ian. Would you consider letting the board being able to view the key and emerging risks in real time, like through a corporate risk management solution, so that they can see the most up-to-date data?
Yeah, I think it needs to be there. I think that when we are carefully orchestrating a conversation around risk and we miss the opportunities to daylight things that are happening in real time, we miss a trick. And I think there are some tools out there that are very good at providing that up-to-date information. We do need to guard against any echo chamber. I did some work with a client last year where I purposely went and found viewpoints on different sides of the equation, just so that they are aware of this is the sentiment, so that when Trump talks around tariffs, it doesn't come as a surprise. When Trump talks around reversing any ESG or DEI initiatives, it's not a surprise. We need to be thinking about that. So yeah, I would encourage that to be part and parcel of the conversation.
Yeah, thanks. And then one for myself, Ross. I guess you're probably preaching to the converted here around being there earlier at the table for the strategic conversations. But how are you finding, in your experience with boards, their appetite to engage us a lot earlier?
To be quite honest, I find board agendas seriously oversubscribed. And anything that's pertinent that's happening in the business at that time can easily lead to risk papers being delayed and pushed out. It might be seen as less important. And I guess the view from the board is they might have an understanding of that in their own capacity. They might see flavors of it coming through in other areas. But I do find that first and foremost, they will come back from sort of Institute of Directors breakfasts and see what their peers are doing. And obviously board members sit on multiple companies. So you get an averaging out of what they're seeing. I think that there is an interest to have those conversations. Where it becomes particularly difficult is that the executive and their management layers are very cautious of what they're going to be held to account to. So they will manipulate it. Now, obviously, in financial services, work around risk appetite and those sort of requirements are very well oiled and are done on a regular basis, and the business knows how to do it, and all your peers are doing it, and there are those requirements. Outside of financial services, there's sometimes a challenge. They really, is probably an acid test, and will answer your question, is we will set criteria within the risk appetite, a financial quantum or whatever the case may be, and then something will happen in the business which should have triggered the appetite or caused there to be concern, and it's well, it doesn't matter this time. And yes, there will always be those we need to accommodate for those instances and provide that leniency and that flexibility. But the minute that you do that too often, you nullify or you undermine the value of that risk conversation or those risk artifacts. Because if we're just going to ignore it, what does it matter? I have also been in another organization where I was providing monthly updates to the board on the appetite, and quite often things would show up as red. And after several months, one of the board members just said, why is this always red? Why are we not seeing it shifting? And I guess there wasn't an appreciation within the business that there were a million things going on, and that just happened to be a theme that couldn't necessarily be addressed. I think it was engaging the customer sector and getting feedback from them, and the survey they were using and the provider they were using was wrong. But it did show that if we're going to sort of put a peg in the ground for that metric, we should hold ourselves to account for it.
Yeah. And there's another interesting one here from Ben. So what skills, information and capabilities do risk people have that strategy people don't? And therefore, can we better educate the people developing the strategy to address the risk at the time versus getting involved?
So partly, I think some of the shortcomings that I was mentioning of risk people, this sort of being beholden to frameworks and compliance and structure and, everything being black and white. We do know that there are these requirements from a disclosure perspective and from a reporting perspective that are not grey. They're quite black and white, which the strategy world is probably greyer than that. So we have the skill set to come back and go force some conversations to be more precise and to be the translator. How do we translate strategy conversations and execution into more black and white reporting, and how do we translate black and white requirements into strategy conversations? And I've been party to some recent conversations where the disclosure requirements, particularly around climate, are being seen by some organizations as being quite burdensome on strategic conversations. And this is where risk is almost the arbitrator and is trying to balance those two to go, what do we need to do? And how is this compromising the business? And how can we do this more effectively? So I think it's the strategists will obviously be more gung-ho and wanting to pursue things. And the risk people should be wearing multiple hats of going, that's fine on one hand, what happens on the other hand? And so playing multiple roles.
Yeah, and presumably it's a little bit of a cultural thing as well. To the point that if you engage with the people involved in developing strategy, and you can influence them over time, and then they get in the back of their mind that they're considering risk as part of that strategic conversation, then hey, you're on a better roadmap ahead. Yeah.
And I think the last thing, just before we close off, is that if you don't reside in any one functional area, you don't have any sacred cows yourself. So you can ask questions that are, you can ask it. Obviously, it can curtail your career in that organization if you push the bounds too much, but that's one of the other benefits that the risk practitioner has.
All right. Look, I'm just conscious of time. Look, thank you for those who asked those questions. And Rodney, you made an observation that I'll just build on as well. Great presentation, quite a lot to unpack in there. I think for me, the variety of the strategic archetypes are fascinating. The how do we do the integration piece, and then the piece that I can certainly resonate where it's misaligned and it doesn't work well. So I think that was great to see that, and obviously then outlining some tools that we can consider in making any improvements. So I guess just on behalf of everyone here, Ross, thank you for such an engaging and insightful presentation. And as always, it serves up some great insights and things for us to unpack, take away, and get benefit out of. So we look forward to the next Lunch and Learn episode with you, Ross. So thank you, everybody, for attending today, and look out in your calendars for the next exciting session.
Yeah, and maybe just to say that Kerry does have a hard copy of the presentation for circulation,
Yes.
and so you'll have more time to unpack it and understand some of those things than what I had to sort of get through quickly today.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Thank you very much, everyone. All right. Take care.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.